Is there a plan for a new world order, a one world government, and how do we stop it?
Well, I think even our first President Bush said that the New World Order was in tune, and that's what they were working for. The UN is part of that government. They're working right now very significantly for a North American Union. That's why there's a lot of people in Washington that don't care too much about our borders. They have a philosophical belief that national sovereignty is not important. It's also the reason I have made very strong suggestion that we need not be in the United Nations for our national security.
The election process will become the task of world government monitors. The U.S. Congress, President, judicial system, and state and local government shall exist only as a facade to assure American citizens that they still have a voice in government. Checks and balances among branches of government will be eliminated. The states will become mere subdivisions of the national government, just as the national government will become a subdivision of the world government. The Bill of Rights portion of the U.S. Constitution will be superseded by the UN Convention on Civil and Political Rights. The U.S. Constitution will be supplanted by the UN Charter and consigned to the ash heap of history, a useless relic of the past.
I believe those individuals in this country, and there are plenty, who believe that we should have the right to own and bear arms, ought to be concerned with what's happening in the United Nations, because they are a threat to us. They would confiscate our guns. There have been proposals made at some of their conventions where they would literally repeal the Second Amendment. And I think that everybody should be alert to this and realize that this is not just fun and games, and this is just not a discussion club that we're dealing with. Individuals who believe in the right to own property ought to be concerned. Americans believe in that. They're careless about it. Sometimes they allow our governments to regulate too much and to tax us too much. But really, the right of private property ownership is severely threatened by our own government. But it's going to be a lot worse if the United Nations gets involved. There is no way that you can have the concept of private property right. They believe in welfare redistribution, socialist redistribution, that everybody owns everything, and they would take from the wealthy and give to the poor to get an equal balance. Same old story that we've heard for years, but they do not protect the right to own private property by anything promoted by the United Nations. If United Nations has their way, there will be curtailment of our right to practice religion. They are not going to be believers in the right to practice our religions as we have seen fit throughout this country, and therefore those individuals who are interested in this subject certainly cannot be complacent about what the United Nations is doing.
Get us out of the UN. March 20th, 1997, Capitol Hill. Texas U.S. Representative Ron Paul introduces one of the most crucial bills regarding the future of freedom, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. Its purpose, to provide for complete withdrawal of the United States from the United Nations.
Well, I don't think we need the United Nations to be able to talk to other nations. The United Nations was established in 1945. We talked to a lot of nations before that. We have our embassies, we have our ambassadors, we can pick up a telephone these days and talk to whoever we want around the world. So I do not think that is a legitimate excuse. That is just an excuse to do the bad things that the United Nations does. Every year since we belonged to the United Nations, we have lost a little bit of our sovereignty. And we're moving in that direction where eventually we will not have the United States of America and will be nothing more than a pawn of the United Nations.
It didn't take long for word to get out. Soon, Dr. Paul's office received messages from other representatives willing to co-sponsor the bill, and an avalanche of congratulatory letters from the American people thanking him for introducing this crucial bill covered his desk. June 4th, 1997, 54 representatives vote in favor of the Get Us Out measure. A few years ago, it was unlikely if 4 representatives would have supported it. Even though the measure didn't pass, the numbers are a solid indicator of the accelerated support for the United States' immediate withdrawal from the UN. And with the help of more and more Americans, Congress will again be forced to vote whether or not to get us out of the United Nations for good.
The Congress tends to be political at times. They tend to respond to what they hear, and they think there's enough people in their district that want them to vote a certain way, they all of a sudden will become interested. The American people are starting to wake up. I think we're making a lot of progress, and I predict we're going to get a lot more votes next time.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge the leadership of this body to bring a very important vote to the House floor. I recently introduced H.R. 1146, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, which would end our participation in the United Nations. Millions of Americans have begun to question why we continue to spend $300 million each year funding and housing an organization that is actively hostile to American interests. Surely Congress, which routinely spends 15 minutes renaming post offices, can spare 15 minutes to vote on this fundamental issue of American sovereignty. Obviously, many Americans now want to get out of the UN because they resent its refusal to sanction our war in Iraq. The administration deserves some credit for ultimately upholding the principle that American national sovereignty is not a matter of international consensus and that we don't need UN authorization to act. But the administration sent mixed signals by doing everything possible to obtain such authorization and by citing UN resolutions as justification for our actions. The message seems to be that the United Nations is credible when we control it and it does what we want, but lacks all credibility when it refuses to do our bidding. Perhaps it's time to stop trying to manipulate the United Nations and start asserting our national sovereignty. If we do not, rest assured that the United Nations will continue to interfere not only in our foreign policy, but in our domestic policies as well. UN globalists are not satisfied by meddling only in international disputes. They increasingly want to influence our domestic, environmental, trade, labor, tax, and gun laws. UN global planners fully intend to expand the organization into a true world government, complete with taxes, courts, and possibly a standing army. This is not an alarmist statement. These goals are readily promoted on the UN's own website. UN planners do not care about national sovereignty. In fact, they are openly hostile toward it. They correctly view it as an obstacle to their plans. They simply aren't interested in our Constitution and Republican form of government. The choice is very clear. We either follow the Constitution or submit to UN global governance. American national sovereignty cannot survive if we allow our domestic laws to be crafted or even influenced by an international body. This needs to be stated publicly more often. If we continue down the UN path, America as we know it will cease to exist. Noted constitutional scholar Herb Titus has thoroughly researched the United Nations and its purported authority. Titus explains that the UN Charter is not a treaty at all, but rather a blueprint for a supranational government that directly violates the Constitution. As such, the Charter is neither politically nor legally binding upon the American people or government. The UN has no authority to make laws that bind American citizens because it does not derive its powers from the consent of the American people. We need to stop speaking of UN resolutions and edicts as if they represented legitimate laws or treaties. They do not. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I'm merely asking House leadership to schedule a vote on H.R. 1146, the American National Sovereignty Act. Americans deserve to know how their representative stands on the critical issue of American sovereignty. And I yield back the balance of my time. I rise as a member of the International Relations Committee, but I would like to express my disappointment that of my amendments that were offered to the Rules Committee, none of them were approved. So that was a great disappointment to me. I will vote for the rule, recognizing the fact that it is hard to accommodate everyone, but nevertheless it is very clear that I have been an outspoken opponent of the United Nations, and the amendments that we will be discussing will really not deal with the essence of whether or not we should be involved as we are. I think we're tinkering on the edges and will not do much to improve the bill, even if some of the amendments get passed, which I will support. But But I do think there's some serious things that we must consider. One is the issue of national sovereignty. To support H.R. 1646, you have to give up some of our national sovereignty to the United Nations. There's $844 million for peacekeeping missions. We know now that we live in an age when we go to war, not by declaration of the U.S. Congress, but we go to war under UN resolutions. When we vote for this bill, and if you support this bill, you support that concept of giving up our sovereignty and going to war under UN resolutions. I would have liked to struck all the money for population control. I will support the Mexican City language, but it really doesn't do that much. All funds are fungible, and if we provide hundreds of millions of dollars for population control and say, please don't use it for abortion, you just shift the funds around. So there is no real attack on the use of American taxpayers' money for abortion if we don't strike all these funds. The United Nations have already laid plans for an international tax. This January it was proposed. They would like to put a tax on all currency transactions to raise $1.5 billion. This is abhorrent. This should be abhorrent to all of us. It should be abhorrent to all Americans that we would have an international tax imposed by the United Nations. Already the United Nations is involved in tax collecting. In Bosnia right now, in Serbia, the UN, one of their functions is to collect taxes on goods coming into the country. There was a demonstration not too long ago by the Serbs objecting to this. The idea that UN soldiers paid by American taxpayers that are now tax collectors in Bosnia should arouse our concern. The only way, since we do not have the amendments to reject some of this funding, the only way we who believe that our sovereignty is being challenged is to reject 1646. I see no other way to address this subject because it is not in our best interest to go along with this. The way the bill is written right now, we will support the Kyoto Treaty. And the International Criminal Court is also something that we should be contending with.
The other thing that bothers me about going into war, not only is it without a constitutional declaration, but we go in inevitably under the UN. I mean, even in this war, we went in to enforce UN resolution. So I would say the proper position that we should have for the UN is that there's no need to be in the UN. Why don't we just get out? Nation that protected liberty here at home and yet traded with people and traveled and were friends with everybody, we still would not need the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the NAFTA or NAFTA or the New World Order.